crap. Good afternoon, friends. I'd like to welcome you today to What's in Tegan's Storage Locker, the show that dares to ask the question, what is in my storage locker? By now you should know the drill. The answer is comics. I get a pile of random comics out of the boxes. If we get through 5, if we're lucky, I just yak about whatever I want to yak about, and the cat interrupts us occasionally. He has a lot of energy tonight. I am a lifelong cat owner, folks. I have never in my life had a cat who demanded so much attention. And that's what it is. I've never had a cat who really wanted that much interaction. And that was how I thought almost all cats were, until I found a cat who is a lot more like a small dog. I've had small dogs that had much less of a need for attention than this guy. But he knows how to ask for my attention. I think you all, if you've seen this show for any amount of time, you know that he knows how to ask for my attention when he wants it. But we go on anyway. You have to go forward with life. Anyway, so the drill. I got a pile of comic books, more or less random, not like totally random. I'd go through and pick out things that might be interesting, and we look at them on the camera here. Starting off with an issue of X-Force because, 2 or 3 videos ago, I looked at some really early, really raw work by this guy here, Cheung, sometimes Jimmy. Really unformed, very young, but still kind of appealing, work, but very early work from Cheung on the Iron Man book the other day. And this was, I want to say this was April 99, so this would have been at the tail end of 98. He was doing that. That was after the year that he spent on that series that I was telling you about. I don't have any in these boxes. But next time I go up there, I'll try to pick some out. Maverick. Because that was, as I said before, and I'll probably say again, it was the series that really made him who he was. It was not perhaps, I remember the story being pretty decent, but I was really jazzed about it because of the art. And that isn't usually like me. Usually, the writing isn't that great. But that one kept my interest with the art. So I liked his stuff early on. And he's gone on to do some very good, very, very nice looking comic. His art has been the best part of some very mediocre events. They were mediocre because he drew them. They were bearable because he drew them. And that's a skill. That's a skill. I like the guy's work. And it was attractive even back then in 1998 after, he'd been working for a few years. But, he hadn't really still come into his own when you think about the work he'd be doing just a few years later. But this is towards the I would not have guessed that he'd written this long, but John Francis Moore, he actually, he had a fairly long run on this book, I want to say. Actually, a couple of people had decent length run. That's the weird thing about X-Force is that, Rob was only on it for the first year. He would have actually stayed on it in some capacity at least, if things had gone just a little bit different. But he was out. He's only come back for, bits and pieces here or there. And then without him, the book was sort of left to its own devices to develop an identity, and to a degree it did. Partly, I think, because it really lucked into getting Great Capullo when Great Capullo was really coming up. Off of Quasar, he probably could have gone in a number of different directions, but they picked him for that X-Men spinoff. It wasn't the #1 book, but it still sold really well. A lot of eyes were on it, and frankly, it didn't have the best reputation from its earliest days. So, like, the odd thing is, later on in the run, it actually gets to be a really good book because, they actually put some people on it who knew how to do what they were doing. Adam Polina, very, kind of left of center artist for mainstream books, but very interesting stuff. He had a lengthy run on the book. Greg Capullo, as I said. Interesting stuff if you go back there and fish around. If you like this set of characters, there's a few of the New Mutants and a few of the others. Although I do not remember. Do not ask me to remember what was happening at this point in the book. I was still enjoying it because clearly I was still buying it. I only quit buying it, I think, when they did when I basically dropped out all the X books. The period from Magneto War to the 12, which I could sort of pretend that I liked on account of the fact they had Alan Davis doing it. And I never hate buying Alan Davis, even when I know it's, maybe the story isn't that great or something. And that was the thing. He had the, this period of the X books it seems in hindsight kind of aimless. But what it was some very, sort of quiet stories, relatively speaking. I got Alan Davis to do a year, over a year, I think he was on the books. And basically they were just cleaning up all the stuff that was just left over after all the driving forces behind the early 90s books was gone. None of those stories were finished. If you were an X-Men story started in the early 90s, you were finished by someone with a British accent, almost certainly. And that is just a weird state of affairs because all those people set balls in motion for years that none of them ever actually got to pay off, and they all had to be paid off down the line by other people. And, to a degree, that's part of, that's part and parcel of the X-Men, is there are periods where the books maybe aren't that good, but they actually can still be generative in terms of, fans and readership and certainly characters. So that if you go back and read these couple years of X-Men books around like the turn of the century before Chris Claremont came back, they're not that bad. They're actually pretty decent because they sort of had to be. They had to put people on the books who knew what they were doing, or the readers would have jumped ship. But that's what happens when it's a real bear market. Marvel retracts, and if they have good people, if they have any good people, they end up being on the top selling books so that those books don't suffer. That's why the X-Men books were, could be pretty decent on occasion at the time, even when they weren't overall that good, if the distinction makes sense. Because look at this. This is a gorgeous comic book. Maybe if I sat down and read a bunch of this in a row, I maybe wouldn't think it was so special. But just looking at it, from like a 10,000 foot remove, all these years later, this is a very nice looking comic book. The use of shadow on these pages is masterful. First generation of our friends, the Pokemon. And Stan's soapbox was still in the books. But it was just doing a Q&A at this point, and it was, and a lot of it was, kids writing in with, questions for Stan Lee, so not of that much interest. He's not even doing a lot of energy, or, whoever's writing this isn't putting a lot of energy into selling, the tertiary, Marvel movies anymore, because at that point, the process was more or less out of his hands. After all the years he had spent, very, intimately, laying down groundwork in that town, I guess you could say. That was, later able to be used to, great effect. Also, this is 6 months into the Marvel Knights Daredevil, situating where we are in time. Captain America Sentinel of Liberty. They tried, I think this book lasted a year. It's a really good year. It's sort of like a Legends of the Dark Knight for Cap with, this one has Mark Waid and Cully Hamner. That's a nice looking book. I don't even really remember it, but I remember the whole series pretty much had had a pretty good run of people on it. We're well into the Chris Claremont Fantastic Four, Dan Jurgens and John Romita Thor, which is kind of an underrated run of comics, especially if you're a fan of John Romita Jr. That might be a run of his that is less, looked at than others. It's the one where he was really consciously trying to go Kirby. And it's really nice looking comics. And, Dan Jurgens, I'll actually probably go to bat for saying that his run on Thor from the beginning to the end, he writes the character for a good long, like 7, 8 years, I want to say. He has a good long run, and it's the best non-DC thing that I've read. He really put a lot of work into, the beginning is very traditional action type stuff, and then later on, he keeps the book in the first part of the New Marvel period, and it becomes actually kind of a thoughtful meditation on the nature of religion, believe it or not, because he just sort of goes with it and has Thor actually become a figure of worship on Earth again, which is something they don't talk about very often. But, it was a real big thing for a couple of years, and they sort of took the stories in a weird direction that maybe doesn't get as much appreciation, because it wasn't one of the New Marvel books that was really like, it wasn't really, burning up the charts or anything, but at the same time, it was like one of those runs during the period that isn't, someone new to Marvel or new to comics, but someone who was just like working in like a new style. And I'd say he did that in the same way Bruce Jones did when he did that fantastic run on Hulk. Peter David even changed up his style considerably. It takes much less time to read a Peter David comic book now. He should go back to doing as much dialogue as he used to do back in the day. That's what we loved. This was the tail end of the Joe Casey and Jose Ladron, the very tail end of their run on Cable, which may be the best Marvel book of the period. But its only real competition is the Casey Deathlog. I can't remember if that's running at this point or not. Because they're still on the Magneto War, so that's still a little bit in the future, but that run, it's the best thing at the line. Even in the context of the early Marvel Knights period, the Ladron Cable was the best thing they were publishing, hands down. Every month that Ladron deigned to draw a Marvel comic book, it was the best looking Marvel comic book of that month. He graduated almost immediately to like the level of people, working with, Jodorowsky and stuff. So the fact that he did a pretty decent length run on Cable, he did a Fantastic Four annual in the middle of nowhere. He did an Inhuman series. I loathe the Inhumans, but I will read them when they're done well, and they have been done well a couple times. Something to do with the Bedlam Brothers, who I don't remember at all. Oh, Domino with the short hair. Gotta love that look. She had when Brian Stelfreeze, if you have not read the Brian Stelfreeze Domino, it is, for a character who has had precious few solo outlets, it is an excellent series. And later on, they did actually a couple of limited series with her in the last few set of years that were good too. Gail Simone did some wonderful work with the character. I really like her. I would read any Domino they put out, but they don't put her out very often. But just about every solo book they've ever put her in has been pretty decent. Siren, there's a character who, if, really doesn't start off New Mutants really being that much of a player. But she's probably the character who I think maybe gets the most development. She's the one who has her long battle with alcoholism. It runs over a couple different writers, I think. And they never do anything with her character. People loved her, and they never touch her nowadays. That is inexplicable to me. people liked her much more than Banshee, and that is just an objective fact. No, all right, look, I know that the Banshee fans are going to pipe up, but objectively speaking, he's not one of the more popular X-Men characters. He just isn't. People loved her. And that costume was great, too. She's still rocking more or less, I think, the same look that Adam Polina gave her, which Cheung makes look really good, too. No clue what's going on here, but, you know, it's a very nice-looking book. Oh, man. Their subscription form has shrunk. Man, you know some of the subscription forms that we looked at earlier in the decade, and you can look and see here now. This is what they were confident they were going to be able to sell another year of. You know, and it's, you know, you got Thunderbolts. Gambit actually did have a book for a couple years. It was pretty decent. Inexplicably had a Jim Starlin cover once. Not the guy you expect to be drawing Gambit, yet he's got a few Gambit covers. They were just pulling in like weird people to fill strange holes during this period. That's how you get Alan Davis on Uncanny X-Men for like a year and a half. Larry Hama was writing Generation X for a few years. I think I want to say a few years, at least a couple. You know, think about that. That is a very strange series of events that have to go down before the guy in the room to take over Generation X is Larry Hama. And yet, as I recall, he did a perfectly fine job with the book. Very, you know, if nothing else, a very flexible writer. That's a nice, you know, reveal. Oh, I guess Farrell is already a bad guy by now. You know, they never really had anything to do with her character. I think they have corrected that at least a little bit in recent years, but of all the characters from the first run of X-Force, like they went back and they've done a lot with Shatterstar, you know, a lot of these characters, but she got the short end of the stick. They never really gave her much development. I know she has fans. I'm not saying anything against her. She's a fine character. All right, well, we spent almost 20 minutes on one issue of X-Force. We're doing great, folks. Oh, how about this? I've been wanting to look at this for a while. Some Ron Frenz Thor, because I got a pile of these. Now, I'm thrilled, absolutely tickled pink to see that his work has gotten significant reevaluation. I think it could stand for some more. You know, he did a lot of work, a lot of work on different books. I mean, he didn't stray too far from, you know, meat and potatoes superheroes. That really was his thing, what he wanted to do. He's like John Buscema if John Buscema gave a crap. And I say that with all the affection in the world for John Buscema, who famously, vocally detested drawing superheroes. And you can see by his superhero work in the 90s, because he still does a fair amount in the 90s, I don't know, it's some weird looking work. It doesn't, you know, he gets to the point where I think he's just trying to draw them really fast in a way that I always found a little bit off-putting, even if they're all still completely, like, 100% solid. But Ron Frenz, you know, that's his lane. That's where he wanted to be, you know. You want to see good John Buscema, you pick up Conan. He really put a lot of himself into Conan, and he did Conan at various points in his career as well. So, you know, if you want to see why people talk about John Buscema like they do, pick up an issue of Conan. He was pretty good on the Avengers, I think, because even if he didn't like the material, he liked working with Tom Palmer. He worked with Tom Palmer enough. I think I liked how his pencils looked with the guy. And they do, you know, even those Avengers books, which you know, 100% verifiable for a fact, you know, he was not putting a lot of himself into, still look like $1 million. And that's, you know, that's the bitch of it. But anyway, we're here to talk about Ron Frenz, part 1 of the Black Galaxy saga. This is The first part of this big climactic arc that, I'm trying to find the credits here so I can show you, but yeah, we'll just flip ahead to the credits here. This is the, more or less the swan song of this specific team. Not the Tom DeFalco and Ron Frenz team, but the Tom DeFalco, Ron Frenz, and Joe Sinnott team. Joe Sinnott inked Thor for a solid 2 years, maybe a little over 2 years, in the late 80s, with with Ron Frenz on pencils. He worked with Frenz a few times. He actually worked a fair amount with some other pencilers too. He was fairly prolific. He was doing a monthly book well into the 90s. And he still worked, but he sort of eased off monthly, more or less, around here or too much later. But he still, the work he did in the 80s, the work he did in the very early 90s, it looked so good. And I think it was the kind of, it looked so good that it made Ron Frenz draw better, if that makes sense. Because seeing how his lines looked, with someone like that at the drawing board, he knew would make it look, look, this is the freaking right Jellians. They're like not the most exciting alien species at Marvel. And he makes them look really cool. How is that even? They shouldn't look cool. Get Joe Sinnott inking Ron Frenz, and they look like how they're supposed to look. This is just quite a good-looking comic book. And I was just a kid. I was buying it off the stands. I had no clue that in context this was as nice a looking comic as it was. I don't think people appreciate it. I know for a fact this was not my favorite looking comic book, because even if I wasn't like totally on board with all of the X-Men books, I still at least recognized what was considered cool. And I liked Thor. I really enjoyed Thor. But I knew Thor wasn't cool. And I knew the art wasn't cool. But now, of course, I look back on it and think, well, there's a reason why I read all of these books, even if supposedly the art wasn't to my liking. And it was because the art actually really was to my liking. I really have come to love his work over the years. Look at this. It's not even completely on model for Kirby is the thing. He even seems to streamline some of Kirby's designs sometimes. Just total efficiency in storytelling, not without beauty or ornament or anything, but at the same time, just absolute, clearly efficient. You can read and follow what's happening, even if you don't pay attention to any of these word balloons. You see, the High Evolutionary didn't like what that guy was saying, so he zapped him. And his assistant there, he's taken aback or whatever. He reads it right on the page. It's a high-stress situation. You see when he does the big pull out here, and it's a celestial. So immediately what the stakes of the story are. The stakes of the story and communicated in this one panel. Things are about to go big time. Just listening to Nine Inch Nails for some reason. This character who actually stuck around, did a couple more things later in this run. I think that since then they've only really appeared in one of the Annihilations, because, pretty much every cosmic character they brought back for those Annihilation events. I gave a few of those characters new life, but then they're just a bunch of, like this character from Tom DeFalco, Ron Frenz, Thor, who I don't think anyone has really used for more than a couple of things since, crowd scene stuff. TSR spent a lot of money on Marvel Comics ads. It was a rare Marvel comic that didn't have at least one page, if not a center spread, and often the back cover, for years running seemingly the back cover. and that's just, they don't sell advertising anymore. It doesn't occur to them. And, probably maybe wouldn't, but, they don't even ask, I don't think, whether or not they just don't have ads except for like M&M's. M&M still advertises on the back cover sometimes, but that's it. At this point, M&M's does it just for the prestige of, being the only one. I don't know. This is Thor's human alter ego at the time, Eric Masterson, who was not just, another name for Thor. He was actually another dude with his own kid, and his life suffered. His life went, and there was actually kind of an odd undercurrent in this book of domestic anxiety that wasn't usually present in Thor, because this guy here, he becomes, like Thor's human half, and it's kind of like a Captain Marvel thing, where, he knocks the cane, and, Thor takes over for a while, but he just, more or less just goes away, like Billy Batson goes away. And so his life just goes completely to heck. But he's also surrounded by gorgeous women. He's got, his supporting cast is nothing but attractive women. So you don't hate him being in the book. They know, and here we go. There's Hercules doing more or less what anyone reading the comic imagines Hercules spends his free time doing, because it's, Hercules of Greek myth. Hercules is another character they don't really give a book very often, but usually when they do, they at least have a plan. Usually kind of decent. Oh, and he's freaked out because this robot pretending to be Sigurd Jarlson, who was a very brief alter ego that Thor used when he just wanted to, basically just wanted to hang out around regular people and work as a construction worker for a while. And every now and again he busted out for some reason or another, because he actually met people and made some connections in the Manhattan construction world. Kind of like being a frog, comes up periodically. And there you go. So swears the mighty Thor. And he's like, okay, dude, you got my old identity. You got my attention. It turns out it's this dude named the Replicoid from earlier in the, 2 years previous in the DeFalco Friends run. When they first dealt with the Celestials. The Celestials created a clone of Thor, basically, to tell Thor what to do. That makes about as much sense as anything the Celestials do, because this was a point when he spent a few years being very involved with them. Oh, but this, the bounty hunter from the front of the book, she's arrived, and anything that guy wants, she doesn't want to have anything to do with, because she's got a mat on against all the Celestials, and she's willing to level a city block to get in the way of their agenda. And this is actually a fast-paced story, because this was bi-weekly. They pulled this off on a bi-weekly basis. The Black Galaxy saga. Now, the reason they were able to do it, even though I don't doubt that they probably could have done the whole book, but it's because the back half of the book, well, not the back half, the back third or so of the book, was a Tales of Asgard adventure. Dan Panosian inking, really pre-Liefeld Panosian, inking Gary Hartle. And if I recall correctly, the backup stories actually have kind of another fast-paced, heavy action story about a war between Ymir and Surtur, which was, I can't remember if they've ever done that since. They basically just decide, I think Ymir comes back, and then Surtur comes back to fight him, and the stakes were basically just everything getting trashed. But it was fun to see. Oh, this is picking up on something I think that happened in the last issue, where Odin, Odin's acting weird and his... Odin's acting weird and his vizier, like, figured it out, and I can't remember it. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, you know, Odin, it's, you know, always a bit of both with that man. Hello. You can just sit down there. I can move around you if you just sit down. Thank you. So, you know, the vizier is never really any... you know, Aquaman and Namor both have viziers in their cast. You don't usually see people writing and asking for an all Vulco spotlight. Looking at the letters pages here, I'm not seeing any familiar names. People. Oh well, here's a long-term reader. Guest star of the Silver Surfer in an upcoming issue. Thor 193 with the Surfer stance is one of the best in the series. Man. I always love the letters from the people who've been writing for years and years and years and invested a lot of time in these books. You learn something from those people. What people get, it's important to pay attention to what people get really excited to in this world. Just looking back to see if there are interesting ads I missed. I seem to recall, yeah, you can tell they're definitely playing in the same edge of the pool, trying to, as the Batman movie. They have the same, you know, iconic looking, very simple ad that just no one wanted anything to do with this at the time. I honestly think that the weird prosthetic makeup they did turned a lot of people off, honestly. Strangely enough. They're still putting out a lot of books in 1990. And they're actually putting out some decent books in 1990. Life of Gru graphic novel. Punisher was bi-weekly too. I want to say that was the one where he fights Belasco, is that it? Black Knight had a limited series that absolutely no one paid attention. No one ever paid attention to the Black Knight. I don't even think they've given him a book in the new century. Tales from the Heart, the Temporary Natives. This was this really weird epic thing, and they did a couple of these Tales from the Heart, I think, which were about, I want to say they were like dramas about missionaries or something, not like religious stories. I want to say something like that, or stories about just very realistic stuff that didn't fit at all. But that's, Epic put weird stuff like that on the schedule. They did martial law. They published the first few years of martial law. Martial law was a Marvel book. Straight up. No joke. Jim Starlin is into his run on the Silver Surfer. Man, amazing how generative that run ended up being. My goodness. Marvel is very glad he went back for that run on the Silver Surfer. I tell you what. G.I. Joe 103. That's getting to be about where the Snake Eyes trilogy is. I think that was the last time people really got excited for that book. New Mutant Summer Fun Special. That is an 80-page special issue drawn by Brett Blevins and written by Ann Nesente. Absolutely fantastic looking comic book that no one remembers. Cloak and Dagger, I think, are about up for this. Basically, once this volume was done, they never got another chance at an ongoing. They tried. They got 3 series in that period, and they just couldn't stick. Nam still had a few years to go. Oh, and this is the month that the 2-volume hardcover of the 1940s, Simon and Kirby Captain America. That's actually a pretty interesting book for a couple of reasons. It had some really state-of-the-art reproduction techniques that now people would look back and see as absolutely barbaric, because they had to take the comic book apart, a copy of the comic book apart, in order to take the best, I think, if I recall correctly. And then some wiseacre drew a dong on one of the photographic plates before it went to print, and they had to, I think they recalled the run. So yeah, next time you go into the comic book store and you see that book on the back shelf, because it's probably like $100, $150 at this point, ask if it's the one with the dong in it and see if they call the cops. Still fairly decent. There are a couple, this has a couple books that I don't think, like Stalkers, I do not think that lasted a year. They took the name off the newsstand for some reason, even though it sold really well. They did the same with Power Pack a little while before this. Nemesis. I remember thinking that looked pretty fun based on the ad, but I don't think I ever played it. I didn't have any place to rent the Game Boy games. All right, so what's next? Well, we looked at two Marvel books. Two Marvel books from different eras. Oh, goodness. Okay. I got one. I got him. So let's just look through a late period issue of Cerebus, where, straight up, I've never made any bones about it. To my extreme bemusement and hindsight, I did indeed buy Cerebus. It was, in fact, it was a book that I cherished for its ability to make me angry as much as anything else. It sort of cured me of the tendency to ever want to hate read anything, because I tried it once, and I went down the stretch with Dave, and am I happy I did? I don't know. I don't know if I can answer that question. But I did it. I took those scars, earned those stripes, dubious as they may be. This is when the book, for a few years, was doing these photo covers, and I have to admit, it got kind of, I'm not saying these aren't, but this is basically just like a wildlife photo, or not a wildlife photo, a landscape photo of someplace in Canada. And I'm not saying it's not a nice photo, but, after a while, I forgot what issue was what. And when he started doing regular drawn covers again, it kind of perked up there, I have to admit. He still had Diana Schutz on proofreading, I think, up until the very end, I want to say. Oof. If you see a copy of this book, I'm not telling you have to buy it, but always at least good to see what Gerhardt was doing. Because Gerhardt, he's the person we don't... he put his cart to a really weird ox, and it's not his fault that anything weird happens with the book, because you see, up until the very end, his contributions, although, man, to try and... I remember fairly well, because this series is a character portrait of F. Scott Fitzgerald, and he was not very nice to old F. Scott. And to be fair, a lot of what he pinpoints as the weaknesses in F. Scott Fitzgerald's character, it's not like they weren't present in the man's biography. But at a certain point, I don't know why you do an epic couple-year story about more or less F. Scott Fitzgerald and its intemperance. That's a known quantity. But, it was interesting to see someone who I think genuinely appreciated and enjoyed F. Scott Fitzgerald's work, but who had absolutely no respect whatsoever for F. Scott Fitzgerald as a person, which was, just kind of a buzzkill. It's like, yeah, he maybe wasn't the finest example of the human species at times, but he's also dead and died very young due to his, his various transgressions. So, I can't say I didn't get at least some thought out of these stories. I would not recommend anyone do anything other than flip through and look and just see up until the very end here, although this is the beginning, I see, of the character assassination of Jocko, which just really, that's a lot of people who had stayed with it just because the book was still occasionally decent. I think that's where a lot of them finally tapped out, because he basically just drags her through the dirt in a way that isn't really justified by the earlier one. But here I am. I shouldn't talk about Cerebus, but I'm just proving that I've read it, if to myself nothing else. We all must take account of our sins in this world. It's still a beautiful book, month in and month out. That was never the problem. And Gerhardt, bless his heart, up to the very end, every line, just absolutely perfect. And here's an epilogue, I think, where he's got his F. Scott Fitzgerald character, who's not called F. Scott Fitzgerald. I forget what the name of this, what do we call that? This very lightly fictionalized version of F. Scott Fitzgerald's inexplicably set down in Cerebus's really kind of depressing fantasy world, which was, at this point, I think had been conquered by the matriarchal death cult. Yeah, it made me so angry, and I realized that's no excuse because I was still reading the book. But man, the person I was with at the time, it actually got to be kind of we had a conversation where she just asked me, "Why do you read this book that makes you so angry?" And I had no good answer. It cured me of the desire to ever just stick with anything on the principle of solid completionism. Here's a character from the early days on the book who didn't really come back for much, but it was basically his Groucho Marx stand-in. Actually, the good parts of the first half of the run that I would, say, if you're really interested, there's some stuff in the first half that is still very good. Doesn't bear the scars of the second half. And he actually had a pretty good ear, considering it's a pen and ink drawing, but he had a pretty good eye for caricature. For the voices of, he does, and there's a really weird extended Three Stooges riff in the last run of the book, where the odd thing is he gets their voices, in terms of like what they were going through and the interpersonal drama of the actual actors. It's a very in-depth look at the Three Stooges. And I'm not telling you to read the later half of Cerebus. What I'm doing is I'm telling you what's in it so you know. So, well, let's cleanse the palate with some Simpsons. I'll be absolved of my sins. I bought the first few years of the Simpsons books, and I was very happy to do it. Because, leave it be said, I was among the very, very first people who really had the chance to be excited about the Simpsons, because I was like 7 or so years old when those cartoons came on the Tracy Ullman Show, and we watched the Tracy Ullman Show. My parents liked Tracy Ullman. They thought that she was hilarious. I kind of thought she was kind of boring sometimes because I was 7 and I was waiting for those cartoons at the commercials. So yeah, when they finally got their own show, it was a big deal. It was huge. And I loved it. And I still, I watched it up through... I watched it on and off up through like to the early 20s. And eventually I had to reach a point where I was just like, I'm tapping out. And maybe, maybe at some point I'll go back. I keep thinking at some point it might be fun to do a rewatch of the whole thing if I ever have a lot of time on my hands, simply because the early run of the show is such a big part of my early life. And the medium part of the show was still, I think, really good. I think it was funny for longer than a lot of people credited, even if it clearly wasn't as good. And that distinction sort of dogs even the later Simpsons, when because people say sometimes, oh yeah, it can occasionally still be good. But then they say, oh, it's not great. Not in the same way that the new Stones album is going to be quite as good as the old Stones. But the first few years of Bongo, they were excellent. They did such a good job of just figuring out how to boil the virtues of the show into a comic. And it fit really well. And they put out hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Simpsons comics. Bart Simpson had his own series for many years. Lisa had a series a couple times. They gave weird one-shots to all the supporting characters. And I would pick up those, even back after I wasn't buying the regular line, I'd still check in for the special sometimes, because they were gorgeous. They did a Kang and Kodo special that I wrote a review of for the AV Club, because I just bought this random issue of Kang and Kodos, and it was just a really nice comic book. So they were always capable of doing good work. If you don't like The Simpsons, maybe you'll struggle. And that's a fact. But they put out a lot of work with the characters. I don't even know if that's still in print. You'd think in the age of omnibuses, there would be some thick Bongo omnibus books that a store could have on the shelf, evergreen. And I don't think those books exist, and that seems kind of a shame to me. They could at least put out a big, honking omnibus of all the Radioactive Man stories. I think I have all the Radioactive Man. I think I have every Radioactive Man story they ever did, even the ones on the back of the Simpsons comics. I think. They may have done some a little bit later that I didn't see. But they did a lot of Radioactive Man, relatively speaking, considering it was a really rather inside baseball, in-joke comic book industry satire, through and through. They used the weird Trojan horse of it. It has to be a comic Bart Simpson would read in universe. But doing that, they just, it is, you want a book that goes savage on the Neil Adams, Denny O'Neil Green Arrow in the early 90s. That's what Bongo was doing. And you see, it's more or less, it's maybe not completely, it's a little bit stylized relative to the show. But they got some interesting artists on here. They got Sergio Aragones did a significant pile of Maggie strips sort of later on in Bongo when not a lot of people were paying attention. Bongo published a few series of his, actually. I don't think they ever published a Gru series, but they published a few other things from him. Scott Shaw did some work. Gail Simone had her first published comics work in Simpsons Comics number 50. I remember because I ordered it. I was at the time that much of a Gail Simone fan that I advanced ordered a copy of Simpsons number 50 because she asked us to. And the rest, as they say, was history. I'm not paying really any attention, but you see, it's just The Simpsons and all their supporting cast more or less just having similar adventures to what you'd see on TV. It works on the comics page, even though it's not particularly action-packed, simply because, The Simpsons designs are interesting. People basically still draw cartoons like that. If you think about it, various generations and permutations, Family Guy, all the way up to Bob's Burgers, it all comes from this. They drive they should not have let Patty and Selma fly a plane. Yeah, see, Patty and Selma, Spotlight. Oh, and Matt Groening, I forgot that he did the occasional. He had a fair amount to do this. He had some of his friends like Mary Fleener and Gary Panter. Gary Panter did a bongo book. They had this weird imprint called Zongo. And they didn't do very many issues of Zongo. But the idea was at least to like maybe put Gary Panter's work, out more regularly. And I think they got like 3 or 4 issues out of it. I don't know if they end up selling any more comics with Zongo than they would have Fantagraphics. Maybe if they did it a few years earlier. Yeah, Gary Panter didn't put any book out in 1993 to take advantage of the speculator market. He missed a bet on that one. He should have done an issue of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Man, they should have asked him. He might have done it. When they, the period of Ninja Turtles, when they were just like asking, anyone to come in, anyone who was good to come in, they should have just asked Gary Panter to do an issue. He did Pee-wee. It's not that much of a stretch. They always had letters. They had bongo profiles of the various, it's classic comic book, letters page and bullpens. Oh, and here's a little news story about Bozo the Clown actually complaining about the Krusty the Clown character. Oh, what are you going to do there? Oh, yeah, so you flip the book over, and this was even if the lead story might have just been, another episode of The Simpsons, the back was something, usually a little bit like, hey, a B-Man spotlight. Admittedly, I think it's only 1 page. Yeah, 1 page gag strips of... oh, yeah, it was 2 pages. I'm wrong. It's not 1 page gag strips. It's 2 page strip for the B-Man. And then a Dr. Nick activity page. You can finish the radioactive man's forehead. And, they probably, I think, would have, if I had the next issue, I'd be willing to bet they because that's the real address. They probably printed a bunch of those. And they did a couple Itchy and Scratchy books. They really, I guess they figured they could only get a couple issues out of Itchy and Scratchy. But they were fun, too. They were one of the launch titles. Pretty much any of the early bongo books, if you have any affection for The Simpsons at all, you see them in a quarter bin or something, they're good books. Good books. Bill Morrison's the guy you want to look for. Bill Morrison is as close as the Simpsons comics came to having their Barks, the guy who knew how to draw like the boss, but maybe a little bit better than the boss, if you know what I'm saying. He went on to do a series called Roswell, also through Bongo, one of the few. There were a couple non-Simpsons Bongo comics, and that was one of a few. I think I have them in a box somewhere, because I bought them. It was pretty decent. Oh, well, we have a couple more minutes. Let's see if we can get to a speed run of something. How about this? How about an issue of Wonder Woman from this was the 2000, I want to say? 1999. This is right before I stopped with Wonder Woman, because I've talked about this before. I bought Wonder Woman for William Mester Loebs, and I bought Wonder Woman for John Byrne. And I've never really had that much of a connection. In hindsight, I wish I could go back and tell myself to keep reading Wonder Woman for as long as Adam Hughes keeps doing covers. Because those books are not something you're going to find in a quarter box. Every Wonder Woman drawing he's done is valuable just for the cover. And it's no flies on anyone else involved in that book. But... I wish I had been buying that book for his covers. Nowadays, I'll buy a book for an Adam Hughes cover. If it's something I'm even halfway interested in and I have the money in my pocket, I'll buy it for the Adam Hughes cover. I'm not ashamed to say. If that's all he'll give us, if he doesn't do any interiors anymore, I will accept the crumbs that he will deign to share with us. This book is actually by Yannick Paquette, who... also evolved into an artist of some distinction. This is, very early work from them. But they would go on to be an excellent artist. This is, very early stuff, what you might expect from someone who gets a run on Wonder Woman, relatively early in their career. I don't know if he's gone back to the character. From the very short-lived Anarchy. I think I bought the whole run, but it didn't last but 10 years, 10 issues. Don't get me wrong, it's still a very good-looking comic book. Stylish. He's almost doing something very similar to a very young J.H. Williams III, who started off doing DC work, did an issue of Batman, did Chase in the mid-90s. Maybe some Tony Harris here as well. Yeah. That's not, see, I'm just not a big Wonder Woman person, so even when it's done well, I know that's awful. I shouldn't say things like that in public. I came back when they gave her a haircut. That was an interesting story. They had Walter Simonson and Jerry Ordway working together on that one, and that is a dynamite team. They were sort of edging their way back. They were kind of figuring out, I guess the Justice Society must have sold pretty well, because for a few years there, like they did a couple Justice Society events, and then eventually after that, then they committed to an ongoing. And then when that took off, that ended up being one of their defining books of the 20-aughts. Thanks to, hey, they got a Black Adam movie out of, a storyline, early storyline in that run of JSA, so. I don't remember this at all. A Batman and Superman series by Carl Kiesel, who, I'll read him do anything. Dave Taylor, Robert Campanella. That's a nice looking piece of promo art. Don't have any idea what's happening with Wonder. This is very near where I left off with the book. Ted McKeever, he did a few Batman books. I've never seen them because they were coming out, I think, in the late 90s. Might be interesting if I ever run across those. Written by Randy Lofficier and Jean-Marc Lofficier. And here's some early Justice League, because this is the 40s incarnation of the team. Hourman, Starman, Johnny Thunder and his Thunderbolt, Dr. Midnight, Wildcat, Red Tornado, the Sandman. I have a big soft spot. I really like the original All-Star comics. Of all the golden age I've ever really gotten into, I really love All-Star comics. If you really want to read what the golden age could do when it wanted to, I'd recommend All-Star as one of the better series that I've read from the period. It's an anthology series, really, where every issue has a story starring one of the members of the cast. They don't really do a lot together. And so you get a really good cross-section of the artists that were working in the period. Crimson, almost to the end of its first year. The only cliffhanger book that really lasted that long. Here's a Superman Fantastic Four crossover that was interesting because it was treasury size. It was had a wraparound cover by Dan Jurgens and Alex Ross, with Alex Ross painting over Jurgens. But the book itself was Jurgens and Art Thiebaert. Decent work. Jurgens, he's good on Superman. I never really, his work on Marvel characters, never really warmed on it. It always seems like he should be drawing a DC book, even if I'm okay with him writing Marvel. Yeah, that's what happens when you're really that closely identified with Superman, I guess. Oh man, back when they were really bringing out all the wrappers for the Sprite commercials and the Voltron, so that's like Fat Joe, Goody Mob, Africa Bambaataa, and Jazzy J. Common, before he was better known as a movie star. Mac 10, that's a respectable lineup for a Sprite commercial. All right, well, we've whiled away another hour talking about comic books here. Oh boy, we got through 5. That's about normal. We've read an issue of Cerebus. You can write me off forever. But, I've never made any bones about the fact that I stuck with it to the bitter end. All right, so, check out the other videos on the channel. I got a fair amount of them by now. I do a weekly newsletter. Goes out with new material. I write about music. I write about anime. I'm in the middle of a multi-part series about Captain Harlock right now, who I absolutely adore. I talk about the videos that are on the TikTok channel. And I put some of my fiction off, although I don't want to let that dissuade you from joining up. It's free, of course. It's not a Substack, so it's free. I got a TikTok channel and an Instagram, both, where I post new comic book reviews every day, actually, that I have a lot of fun putting together, and I think people have a lot of fun listening to. Check out my Patreon if you like this. If I get enough viewers, maybe I'll start putting new episodes of this behind a paywall. Right now, I don't really think I have enough viewers yet for that to matter. But, if we can pick up some circulation around here, maybe we can have some nice things. So go tell all your friends if you enjoyed it, if you got this far. You have to be an evangel for the show. So I have all sorts of incentive to continue doing it. Check out my podcast with Claire Napier. We talk about Top Cow books, Mark Silvestri, Cyberforce, stuff like that, Witchblade. It's called Udder Madness. You can find it on here. I put old episodes up with video annotation, and new episodes are up on Spotify, so it's really the easiest thing in the world to catch up with us. We have a Patreon as well. What else? Be kind to yourself. Be good to each other. Things look bleak sometimes, but there is hope in a world of darkness. Have a very good day. Catch you later.